And Nationals was crazy. You don't know what to expect.
I watched on ESPN.
Yeah, I did too.
Dude, that was fun.
I was excited for Hunter and
Well, that really good heavyweight from Southeastern Florida. Didn't even play the club.
It should have all of your attendance in as well. Thanks for getting caught up on that.
I have all of them. I was supposed to submit them. I was literally just on my way to go and
Yeah,
get my, what's this? I've done all of them.
yeah,
I want to submit it as soon as I plug in my MacBook, because it's
Yeah.
all saved in my Mac, not anywhere, it's all on my cloud. And I was wondering, like, I haven't started on the quizzes. Do you think you could give me this week to complete all of them?
Sure.
Like an extension, because I
Yeah.
missed like the other two quizzes. Well, like, cause I was already coming into class,
Mhm.
but I wasn't able to catch up with the quizzes because I was also working on this, and I don't like stats and I have stats. I'm sorry, it shouldn't be an excuse. It shouldn't be.
no,
But-
we're trying to get you caught up, so I can
I
definitely open this up. Yeah, no, I was just saying, I appreciated you sending me the attendance from the public speaking for the previous classes. They should have that in.
Okay, yeah, I always getting emails from the canvas that I'm
Uh-huh.
getting graded. I'm like, oh, great. But then I'm like, my grades in there, like, I'm a B in that one, but then I'm scoring really low here. So I'm really trying to like catch up here because I don't
Yeah.
wanna, because this class is like, it's impossible to finish a class because like you lecture really good. So I'm like, I have to take advantage of this because like it's a really good class.
I appreciate it,
It's
yeah.
wrong.
Well, we'll continue to get you caught up, so,
Thank you so much.
yeah, of course, thank you. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I just looked at like Friday, and he said like, oh, around that time, and I was like super like scared of it. He's like, yeah, and why we do get actually. And I figured if people do this, I'm really hearing. I always. There's for his work, yeah, some. another show. That's true, I remember that. I'm stressed about it. And I'm not like, I don't even know what it is. Yeah, I think you would choose, that's, I can literally unveil the book. But it's, yeah, every. What? Is it? I asked him, like, just making sure that the baby can fall asleep. But I'm gonna make a call for, so like, going over it because, well, I'll ask him. Yeah. No.
You are.
I've never. So. They were.
I wanted to make them. So. Representative right there. It's.
Oh, yeah. I just heard.
Yeah, but I don't.
Like, we did a lot of practice, means they will start to be-
But it's.
They're also considered- Yeah, it's like, if they're not students, like,
Okay, welcome back. Let's go ahead and get started. Hope you all had a good weekend. We are getting really close to the finish line here. We just have 2 more weeks left in the term. And because we don't meet for the final exam, we basically have this and 5 more classes left. So we're getting really close. I want to give just a little bit of a glance at the remaining class meetings so that you know what to expect as we're finishing up here. So today we're introducing a discussion about conflict, how we manage conflict. And I will also take some time to talk a little bit about the small group observation presentations. Wednesday, we'll continue our discussion about conflict. And I wanted to let you all know that Friday, I've blocked out as a class optional workshop day. So I'll be here. You'll be able to use this space if you'd like to work on your small group observation essay, your presentation, you'd like to run anything by me, you'd like feedback on anything, or you just want a place to practice your presentation or practice tech. So I won't be taking attendance. It won't be required. You don't have to come in on Friday, but I will be here and be available to help you out if you would like that extra time, or just want a space to be accountable and catch up on work. So as far as assignments go, the week 8 quiz, the extended deadline is this Wednesday, so please keep that on your radar. Week 9 quiz is up and due this Sunday. And then the observation essay is due on the 17th. And then the presentations are scheduled for the 13th, 15th, and 17th of March. And I'll be sharing the schedule for that in just a minute. So last class, we took some time to talk about group motivation, right? Some of the ways that we can use feedback and collaboration to allow people in groups to work with each other effectively. In talking about that, we talked about how working in groups means that we can motivate by offering specific incentives, by offering clear rewards and objectives, and making sure that we are offering people the things that we promise them. And we also talked about the importance of providing good feedback, right? Whether we are a leader that's assessing a worker, if we're a peer that's providing advice in friendship capacity, or whether we're a person that's taking in feedback. We talked a little bit about some of the psychology surrounding feedback, and also the idea that offering specific advice, being clear, being civil are things that we generally look for when it comes to giving good feedback. So for today, we're going to talk a little bit about the group presentation and observation assignment, of course, and then we'll be getting into the role of conflict. So I wanted to start by just talking about the essay portion of this assignment. So think about the essay as your final assignment for the course that's due on March 17th. And this involves you writing up and sharing about the group that you chose to observe in an essay. Right, so just as a reminder about this prompt, you're asked to describe what this group is, the context with which they met, the leadership and roles of group members, drawing from our discussion last week about group leadership and motivation, and then the effectiveness of this small group meeting. Right, so similar to other writing assignments in the class, it's about 2 pages, should be drawing from the text and using that to explain what it is that you noted from the group. And again, I'll be happy to look at rough drafts and outlines related to that assignment. And then for the presentation, right, you do not necessarily need to have finished the essay in advance of giving the presentation. In fact, for folks who are presenting on the 13th or 15th, you don't necessarily need to have completed the essay yet. But what I encourage you to do is to have enough to draw from and have a good starting point from which you can share in your presentation. Right. So the presentation is 5 to 6 minutes long. And what I'm asking you to present is what the meeting was that you observed, what happened during the meeting, and some of the things that you learned from the meeting as it connects to our discussions about small group communication, things like leadership, structure, organization, and so You could even draw in some discussion about conflict, as we'll be talking about a little bit for today. So the schedule for the small group presentation, I posted a little bit earlier for today. I did my best to honor the restrictions that folks used on the Google form. So this should be accurate to those. So we've got Calvin, Jade, Daniel, Izzy, Sam, and Lauren on Monday the 13th. On Wednesday the 15th, we've got Lindsay, Kelly, Nigma, Haley, and Jonathan. And then on March 17th, that Friday, we have Nick, Brock, Nicholas, Ben, and Gabriel. So that's 6, 6, and 5. We'll get through that just fine in class. If you know that you're scheduled for a date that you can't make, send me an email as soon as you can so that I can get you rescheduled. Otherwise, have that on your calendar so that you can make sure that you are prepared to come in on that day. So that's there for you as you're preparing. For the presentation itself, I will be posting later this week the full rubric breakdown so you know what to expect here. Again, it's the presentation. I'm not looking for you to be, a stellar public speaker. I'm not going to grade about your use of gestures and your delivery style, right? Instead, I'm looking at your ability to convey the content and talk about what you observed and noted from seeing that small group. So this is a 5 to 6 minute presentation. We have that time limit to make sure we can get through everybody so that we can hear from everybody in the class during that week. 6 minutes is the hard limit. So I will give you signals, but I do encourage you to practice, to pace out your presentation, to time yourself, see how you're doing, add, change, modify as needed. And I'll ask you to wrap up your current thought or idea once you hit the 6 minutes. The expectation for this assignment is that you are presenting face-to-face, unless there's a documented emergency or other issue that is conflicting with your ability to come, and you've checked in with me on that. So on days that you're not giving the presentation, I'd still like you to come to class. I'm still taking attendance for those days so that we can hear from each other, learn from each other, and so that people presenting have an audience that they can work with on this. So I do ask that you include some type of visual aid to incorporate into your presentation. One easy way to do this is to use something like Google Slides or PowerPoint or Prezi. You could also use a video or clip. You could also bring in a prop or visual if you would like. What I encourage you to do is to email me in advance any material that you would like pulled up so that you can make sure that that's available for you to access. And then make sure, right, that you are able to present on that day outside of emergency. So some tips, some things to think about as you're gearing up in order to do well on the presentation portion. So first of all, I encourage folks to practice, particularly practicing the timing of the presentation. I have judged and graded a lot of presentations, a lot of public speaking. What I can tell you time and again is a consistent issue are folks who, and I'm guilty of this too, who get up and present and think, wow, 5, 6 minutes, I've got so much time. And so they go through the beginning of the content in a leisurely pace, then they realize they're at 4 minutes and they still have like 5 slides left and try to rush through the end of the presentation in very limited time, right? So practice timing yourself. One little trick that I like to do is to give yourself a little mark about like at what time you should be at what particular slide, so you know how fast or slow you're going relative to how you should be going, and you can modify it based on that. So try to consistently get in the 5 to 6 minute range. Practice like cutting, adding content based on how close to that range you find yourself in. One other thing that I encourage that can be really helpful is if you print out a copy of slides ahead of time, that prevents you from reading off of them as you're giving your presentation, right? You're instead reading off of the printed version, which allows you to engage a lot more closely, rather than like reading like that the whole time. You can also use something like an outline or notes to yourself that go over the main points so that you can refer back to those as you're giving the presentation. Again, it's not a formal speech grade, but I am asking you to make sure that you're identifying and presenting clear ideas in answer to the prompt, right? So telling us a bit about the group that you observed, some of the things you learned about the group and the way that it's organized. Think about it as your chance to share, right? And really show us what you've learned. And your actual essay doesn't need to fully be done, but instead the presentation is sharing what you've gathered from your observation at this stage. So before we get started with our discussion about conflict, does anybody have any questions about the small group presentation or the essay or anything else in the class at this point? Questions do come up at any point, let me know. I'm happy to look over rough drafts, practice presentations, any material that you'd like to send me in advance, and I'm happy to review that. So what I would like you to do is to, as part one of your attendance for the day, take some time on your own. And what I'd like you to think about is a time that you were involved in a conflict in a group. Maybe it was you and your roommates who were arguing over responsibilities to do. Maybe it was you were part of a team and you were in competition to travel and be a part of the varsity team. Any context in which you were involved in a group that you dealt with a conflict. What happened? How did you feel about the conflict that happened? And secondarily, I'd like you to think about how your group attempted to deal with that conflict if they did at all. What did they do, or did they just avoid and pretend that the conflict was not a real thing? So I'll give you some time to think about and write down your example here, and then I'll ask us to go around and share our examples in just a little bit. Take a couple more minutes on this. go ahead and finish up your current thought or idea here. So what I'd like to have us do is to go around and have each of you share, first of all, what was the conflict situation that happened? And second of all, how did you deal with or not this conflict? Start with you.
My senior year of high school, I played varsity softball, and our group did travel and some little bands, and we were making band assignments. It was supposed to be a senior, junior, sophomore, etc. But there was one girl that kind of made everything about herself, so we didn't want the band. And so other members just made the assignments really quickly and kind of pushed her out. And that was a huge issue, which makes sense. And they kind of ignored it, like school didn't know how to confront her and tell her that she was doing negative, but also we pushed her.
Yeah, that can be a challenge, right? Especially when because I've had to manage some of that stuff too, is figuring out reading into band assignments or room assignments at a hotel. Why are such and such people in such and such group, right? Sometimes people can feel frustrated about a lack of clarification about those assignments, and sometimes people can feel like sharing the reasons behind those is not appropriate to the situation either. So it's a bit of a challenging situation to navigate.
My sophomore year of high school, I was on the varsity football team. And during practice one day, a couple of senior linemen broke out in a fight over some stupid drill. And they were going at it and nobody really did anything about it. The coaches just kind of let it happen. And eventually a couple of players held them back. And I was like, I don't know why the coaches didn't step in, but that was really all they did to manage it or deal with it. They just kind of broke them up and then about it.
Yeah.
And just went their separate ways.
Sometimes conflict, a fight, can be a really surprising, out of left field thing to happen. And so having leadership that's able to address and not necessarily freeze in response to that is a big challenge.
During my sophomore year at college, I remember there was one game that a couple of our center backs or defenders were fighting during the game, at each other. And so after the game, my coach called us the whole team in. And we had a whole discussion and we were everybody was allowed to talk and stuff. And pretty much it was a whole fight. The two girls started fighting again in the whole room and stuff around everybody. And the coaches pretty much just said, don't let it happen again or there'll be punishment.
Yeah. Sometimes there's a moment that's such a conflict in that particular time that saying, you can't have this happen again. It's just the line has to be broken.
Yeah, so I had a friend group in high school where two people decided to date in it, which never really goes on. They obviously ended up breaking up. And I was kind of in the middle of it. One person talked trash to me about the other one and vice versa. We didn't really do anything about it. The friend group literally eventually ended 2 weeks later. Because they just decided to do with them decision. So I guess there was a conflict, but there was kind of no
Yeah. Sometimes groups kind of splinter, break off. There's, having groups that have couples in them can definitely be a challenge. So, sometimes groups just don't last a particular conflict.
One I chose was in high school, our parent teacher was retiring, so the class there was decide who the next one was. Ended up having fucking pretty much after seeing all of our choices. So we had a little voting system. Well, we had a majority rule, the rest held a good growth for a while. That was paid higher now for 2 years.
Well, yeah, that can be challenging when a group is involved in employment and deciding who is going to occupy a leadership or management position. And there's disagreement about who should be in that role. Because you can hold a vote, you can try to engage democratically, but there's still going to be people who are upset about the decision. There's still going to be people who, after the decision, they see somebody they don't like, they're like, well, I told you so. So that can be a big problem. It's conflict over who occupies those positions.
I was a junior in Utah, and I had a friend group. And there's just one individual in my friend group. That was fine.
I guess, just like to bother people, because you get a rise out of it,
Yeah.
and it's. So everyone kind of knew it, it's sort of. But eventually, he started to push my buttons a lot for like almost 6 months.
Wow.
Like all through the first half of my interview before COVID.
Mm.
And so eventually I started snapping at him. And the other people in the group, were like, Daniel, you should just like calm it down, just let him. And I didn't listen. More or less got ejected from the group. And then COVID happened. Most of my friends were seniors, so they graduated and not getting much high school.
Yeah. That can be a challenge when you have people in groups who intentionally try to push each other's buttons and give people a hard time, and then it feels like your response to that doesn't seem proportionate because other people in the group don't understand the conflict as it's happening, right? So how you're experiencing conflict and how other people in the group are interpreting that conflict can be a source of a lot of miscommunication.
So like hard to tell him to stop.
Yeah.
Take it very well. So like no one wanted to say.
Yeah, there wasn't like a way to communicate about that conflict. Yeah.
So this weekend, our lacrosse team, we've been at Multnomah University, and one of my defenders, my goalie, got in an argument in the second quarter of our game.
Mhm.
And, so our coach, she tries to like ignore the instigator of the fight and try to kind of just like let it go, but the other thing she also did was have us all like meet without her during the halftime and be like, figure this out.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of times you'll have people who like individually reach out and be like, well, tell me from your perspective what
Yeah.
happened. Yeah, and try to get the fullest picture that they can, because, you know, there's oftentimes a lot of difficulty in trying to make sense of a conflict that you weren't there to see. And even if you were, right, context that went into understanding the conflict can be challenging to map out.
Okay, so some conflict I faced is on my school basketball team, and the members wouldn't take big injuries, get out of conditioning. And that made me and the other teammates really frustrated.
Yeah.
Feel like they weren't part of the team, you know, right? And we would either confront them or ignore it and hope they figured out we were with them.
Yeah, not pulling weight for the group, being intentionally dishonest, misleading to the group, that can be a pretty big source of conflict because of the impacts that can have on others, for sure. Rick?
So when I was in high school, my volleyball team was traveling to an away game, and one of our starters had forgotten her jersey. We didn't have any extras, so she asked one of the girls who didn't really play if she could borrow her jersey. But we kind of knew that she wouldn't be getting playing time. And the girl said no, she wouldn't want to borrow her jersey, and so the coach kind of told us like, you guys need to figure it out for yourself. Like, I'm not going to tell you guys what to do. You can do it. And so obviously that didn't go down very well. We wanted our starter to be able to play, but we also felt bad like taking the jersey away from the girl. So eventually we convinced her that it was sort of the greater good of the team, but we didn't really have a great way to figure it out. We just a lot of screaming and arguing at each other about it. So we finally just decided that it was for the greater good of the team for her to be able to choose it up.
Yeah, that's hard because in a lot of situations, like you'll have a leader that says, go figure it out, right? Or tries to delegate to a group. And sometimes the intention is, well, the group can work it out and develop skills. But if they don't have the resources to do that, or if there's a lot of, you know, heightened conflict over that, sometimes people do need to step in and be involved in mediating and managing that conflict. Think about it.
Somewhat recent conflict that has affected me is in my current workplace. Just say I have this coworker that sometimes comes in with an attitude, and it always, she always seems to make my mood like drop. As an information desk, I have to always be ready to interact and help what people are asking to. But you know, it's hard to do when you just give them. It's trying not to.
Sure. Yeah.
So, of course, it makes me feel worse, but it also affects my job in the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And as for number two, I would say that I was a bit passive in this approach. I didn't go to my higher ups,
Mhm.
so. It could be a little bit because I kind of see this coworker as a friend, so I don't want to get in trouble.
Mhm.
And it's not like. And so, like,
Yeah. And sometimes you're in a position where it's like the support and role that you're trying to provide restricts you from being able to engage in more direct confrontation, really say what you mean and really express that frustration, especially in a lot of like professional settings, we find ourselves really restricted in our ability to do that. Which can definitely affect our ability to manage conflict effectively too. Okay.
conflict happens between and two people that exist, even though you choose conflict that Christian with it.
Hmm.
Like God really consists the last few questions. Who is people kind of says
Hmm.
those kind of see that others are involved
Mhm.
and how you feel with it.
Yeah, that can be really challenging when you find yourself in a group where like religious or cultural views and faith and those issues are not being respected or accounted for, right? Or somebody says a remark that's culturally insensitive to somebody, right? Is sometimes in a conflict, it's like, well, this is not up for debate. This is not something I want to argue or have a discussion about. So trying to respect the boundaries of people in what is not up for discussion can be a challenge for sure. Nicholas?
So this happened in an online friend group, which focused a lot on video games and gaming. We had a player who is relatively new that joined us like a week ago, and we were attempting to do a very tough fight.
Okay.
One of the games we played. The guy's approach was much more aggressive than the rest of the teams, so he would get himself killed and fight off to get the rest of us killed.
Yeah.
And we ended up spending about 2 hours repeating the same fight over and over again. And then eventually the guy left. In the future, we ended up actually having to kick the player from the group because he wouldn't stop bringing it up over and over again. And no matter how much we tried to explain or teach him, he just wouldn't care.
Yeah, that's challenging, right? Because on the one end, you want to make sure that they're feeling included, but also when they are not improving or they're kind of dragging the group down, that can be a challenge, right? Like back when I played like League of Legends online, right? Like I would have matches where I was doing well and like I'd start to get the gold and carry the team, and they'd be like, "Oh, you're doing awesome! Like you're rocking the mid lane with LeBlanc. That's great." But then if I would like start to die early, like people would just be like, uninstall it, delete it, blah, blah, blah. So it can be challenging in a lot of like you're playing a game or doing some type of activity when there's that discrepancy in skill and experience and how seriously you're taking it. Yeah.
Mine was last year during basketball game. We found ourselves down by a lot. So we're just like, all right, let's just draw up a couple of plays that we know we can work on. It didn't go well, so we called timeout, we held up, and then a couple players started pointing fingers at each other. One thing led to another, it just like turned into like a screaming match. It ended in a lot of conditioning, not fun for me.
Yeah, sometimes there's just conflicts that don't have a good end. Like people are just continuing to feel frustrated.
Last year I had, I really my best friend moved up to that we hadn't known before. Well, one of them moved out on the way through, and so we just had this one roommate, and she just kept breaking the rules with the beginning of the term. And it made us really uncomfortable for the rules were breaking one of the rules made us really uncomfortable, and the other one was just getting really annoying. So we haven't really thought the situation dealt with. It was never really fixed. We did try to talk to her about it, but she was not in a good place to
it's challenging when you have people who aren't receptive to dealing with the conflict, but it continues to get worse and feelings continue to get more heated about it. I appreciate you all taking the chance to share. I think it's good for us to hear from each other about examples of conflict and dealing with conflict, because it helps us to understand some general trends and issues that we encounter in groups that do deal with conflict, right? So a few general trends that I noticed. First of all, are issues of conflict where there's a leader who's not facilitating or managing that conflict in the way that they need to. Maybe they're saying, go figure it out, or maybe there's somebody that's unequipped or unqualified to manage that conflict. That can be a big problem, because oftentimes the leader or supervisors who you look to deal with the conflict, but they're not doing that end, then it can feel really frustrating. Another challenge is the appropriateness of engaging, right? Having people who don't necessarily want to engage with or deal with the conflict, who aren't willing to come to the table, or it doesn't feel worth it to talk about that issue, right? So that's another concern, right? Is how receptive are we to dealing with or addressing conflict, or addressing the feelings or concerns that come up. And lastly, the feeling that it can have a really substantial impact on the group. Conflict doesn't go well, and it doesn't feel like it's being handled, right? That the lack of resolution just kind of erodes at the group over time. So I'm glad you all brought up some of these examples of dealing with conflict, because they really do help us to point to some of the problems and help us to map out some ways to address some of those issues, right? So on face, right, conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. So oftentimes we have this like very fight or flight response when we receive any sort of conflict, right? We're compelled to shut down conflict because we perceive it as a threat. We perceive it as a sign that a relationship is not going well. Things are going to be really uncomfortable or awkward because there's people expressing disagreement or pushing back, right? And in some situations, it's not appropriate, but there's a lot of cases we have to resist that urge to try to shut down conflict the instant it begins. Of course, if conflict is putting people in danger, right, is threatening people verbally or physically, we want to make sure to stop it. But in terms of verbal disagreement and conflict, it can sometimes be used in a way that helps our groups work more effectively. It helps us become more honest, more cohesive. It improves morale if it's happening in a way that is constructive to the group. So we teach a class at EOU called conflict management that gets into some of these issues in more detail. And I think it's important to note that we intentionally called it conflict management and not conflict resolution, right? Because oftentimes resolution is looking for a way to put a neat little bow on it, to have an easy answer to a longer, bigger issue. And sometimes that can make things worse, where we assume a problem is solved, fixed, but really we haven't gotten to the core of the issue. People feel frustrated that they rush to a solution to a conflict that is not so easy to resolve. Conflict management deals with the idea that conflict is something that persists. It's not something that we can necessarily come to an easy solution about. And having to deal with and have conflict in our lives is something that in a lot of situations we have to learn to live with effectively. So in other words, when a group is not engaged in conflict, that doesn't necessarily mean that the group is doing well. It just means that the group is perhaps engaging in groupthink. We talked about this thing in the class, right, where people are self-censoring, they're not sharing their true ideas and thoughts, and in so doing, they can hurt the group as a whole because they're not pushing back, expressing their points, and they're perhaps helping to drive the group off a cliff. To give you a very silly example, when I was a young kid, I was with a group of friends. Parents were out, so we did what any good little kid would do, and we decided we wanted to wrap each other up in toilet paper to become like mummies, right? Then we got really upset and got worried that there'd be all this toilet paper, and oh no, our parents are going to see this. They see that we've made a mess. So what did we decide to do? Well, we decided that we were going to burn all the toilet paper in our backyard fire pit, because that way, if we burn the evidence, nobody will find it. And we nearly caused a big fire in our backyard because of just burning that toilet paper and having a bunch of kids who were not setting a fire properly, right? So nobody at that stage, even with our limited judgment as kids, thought to say, we should do something else. We should like put it in the dumpster, or we should fess up. It's like, not very much money for toilet paper, so it's not that big of a deal compared to burning down a house. So no damage was done, but it's a good idea that we check in with the group and prevent a problem like that before it starts, right? So conflict is not great, but conflict allows us to step in and fix something that could get worse. So conflict is something that is universal, right? We all experience conflict. There are studies of romantic couples. A lot of times we assume that if a romantic couple doesn't fight, that means that they're in better shape. Oftentimes in couples, like there is a lot of anxiety. Oh no, we had our first fight, right? But in actuality, what studies tell us is that couples who have, respectful disagreements, who do argue with each other, are actually reporting higher happiness and more well-being than couples who don't have disagreement, because they have the opportunity to air out their frustrations and try to work together on solving those issues. Okay? Conflict happens when we have incompatible goals. So perhaps both you and a friend want to be the president of a club. That's going to be a challenge where maybe you compromise on it, maybe you have an election. There's going to be some hurt feelings related to that. Conflict is also about scarce resources. We can think about things such as access to water, right? One example, I lived in Northern California right when there was pretty bad drought, and there was a lot of discussion with regard to whether they should have a pipe built that would take water from the northern end into the southern end of the state. And so, right, scarce resources, distribution of resources was the source of a lot of conflict. Conflict can be involved with interference, right? Stepping in and dealing with the conflict, including as a leader. Conflict is not necessarily a sign that a relationship is bad or is going poorly. Sometimes, right, people who get along really well can have conflict with each other. Conflict is something that happens. It can't be avoided, right? Generally speaking, if we don't get at a conflict or a frustration, it's something that comes up later, right? People brought up some examples of feeling frustrated or having somebody in a group who is frustrated and they continue to hold it against other people in the group. That's a consequence that can happen if you're not dealing with conflict in the moment, that people can continue to have those negative feelings that impact their other interactions. Sometimes there's not an easy resolution to a conflict. If you have somebody who is sick and is paying expensive medical bills, right? They are going to have to continue to take out those bills, right? That's something that we can't just resolve in that moment. So conflict can sometimes be a force to help our groups work effectively. There are a few different ways that groups can manage conflict, and in particular, ways that people who lead or facilitate groups can use conflict in an effective way, right? A lot of you brought up examples of groups where a leader was not there to resolve the conflict in the way that they needed to. We'll find ourselves, if we haven't already, in situations where we're having to be a leader dealing with conflict that comes up, right? So there's 4 primary ways. One of them is being a leader as a motivator, right? Who treats a conflict as a problem, a thing that we should try to address and really try to focus on a solution for, right? We don't want to rush to a solution necessarily if we don't have the resources or ability to do that, but they treat it as a group effort, right? So perhaps you're a part of a team and you have only so many people who can travel for varsity, so you have a process by which people can apply, try out, and select who is able to participate as part of the varsity team. So allowing the group to work together to come up with who is able to travel and what's that team's going to look like is one way that happens. There's also a leader as a delegator, right? That's somebody who is taking a step back and moving over the management and conflict resolution goals to another entity. So for instance, bringing in a third party, somebody who's not at all involved in the conflict of the group, is a way of delegating and moving that over, right? Another way that they can do that is by asking people within the group to resolve it themselves. Sometimes that's good if people have the resources and ability to resolve the conflict, but sometimes that doesn't work so well. A leader as a structuralist is somebody who's trying to basically tap into the way that the group works, the resources of the group in order to deal with conflict, right? So For instance, on a debate team, it might be that competitors are trying to make an argument for why they should be traveling for nationals, right? And whoever has the best argument would be able to travel. So it's using elements of the group. Another thing might be using a meeting to talk about a discussion or conflict that came up, referring to an agency like Human Resources. Those can be ways that you can use elements of the group effectively. And then there's also this idea of a leader as a promoter of constructive deviation, right? There are a lot of leadership styles that encourage people to openly argue, to disagree, to push back, to express their views. And in so doing, right, there's this idea that by people bouncing off of each other and sharing each other's ideas, that the best ideas rise to the top. That through the process of open discussion and debate, we can come to a good solution about an issue. So all different ways that we can think about addressing conflict and orienting ourselves toward conflict if we're leading or managing a group. So for part 2 of attendance, what I would like you to do is to address this prompt here about Brenda. So we have Brenda, who's a new supervisor, but her employees have oftentimes been off task and focused and in conflict. I'm going to be numbering you off, and based on your number, I'll ask you to use the leadership style to explain how Brenda would be able to address this conflict. So starting here on this side, Nicholas will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. So if you're 1, your leader is motivator, your 2, leader is delegator, 3, structuralist, and 4, constructive deviation. So take some time on your own to explain how your assigned leadership style could be used by Brenda to address this conflict. So take a couple more minutes here. So when we look at these different styles of leadership, right? Motivator might be somebody who asks the group to discuss productive ways to be involved in this marketing agency, so options to move forward. They might delegate, have somebody outside who is motivating or dealing with issues of personnel. A structuralist might use a meeting to talk about issues like burnout that people are experiencing in the group. And constructive deviation might invite people to openly disagree about designs, marketing, and so on, and give people that opportunity for more democratic participation in the group. So we took some time today to talk a little bit about the small group presentations and to gear up for next week. Again, let me know if you anticipate a conflict with your scheduled day. We talked about conflict, right? The ways that conflict can play a big role in our communication and some of the ways that conflict can be used to improve the cohesion and communication of a group. We'll be getting into that more on Wednesday when we continue to look at conflict small group communication. So please email or pass forward if you haven't done already your attendance for the day. Have a good rest of your afternoon, and I'll see you on Wednesday.